You are standing at the threshold of a mud brick dwelling on the sun-baked floodplain of what will one day be called the
My
Nile
child,
Delta, and the
look at
year is
me.
approximately
Don't you know
6000
your mother?
BCE. And the child on the
Please, look
sleeping
at
mat
me.
inside the dwelling is 7 years old, and she has stopped recognizing her mother. The fever came 4 days ago, and at first it was ordinary in the way that fevers in a settlement of 42 people are ordinary, a thing to be watched but not yet feared, a thing that most children pass through and emerge from thinner and quieter, but essentially intact. Then the rash appeared, and the rash was not ordinary. It began on her forehead and around her mouth as a scattering of small, flat red spots, and within 12 hours, those spots had raised themselves into hard, round papules, and within 24 hours, those papules had filled with a cloudy fluid. And now, on the 4th morning, the pustules cover every square centimeter of skin from her scalp to the soles of her feet in a density so complete that the child inside the disease is barely visible anymore. Her palms are covered. Her soles are covered. The pustules have climbed into her mouth and down her throat, and each swallow is a small negotiation with pain that her body has begun to lose. Her eyelids are welded shut by the pustules that have erupted along their margins, and she has stopped asking for water, and she has stopped asking for her mother, and she has stopped asking for her mother, and she has stopped asking for anything at all. The virus doing this is variola major, and it will not receive its name for another 7,000 years, and it will not be defeated for another 8,000. And in the meantime, across the span of human history that runs from this Neolithic morning to the last natural case in Somalia in 1977, it will kill somewhere between 300 million and 500 million people, a death toll that eclipses every war ever fought by every civilization that ever existed, and it will do this quietly, one child at a time, in dwellings exactly like this one, in villages exactly like this one, on mornings exactly like this one, across every continent that human feet ever touched. The paradigm through which this settlement understands what is happening to the child is a paradigm of angered spirits and violated taboos and the intrusion of something malevolent that must be driven out through incantation and smoke and the application of pressed clay to the pustules and patterns that carry ritual meaning but no antiviral effect whatsoever. The smoke thickens and the incantations continue and the pustules keep multiplying. And by the 5th morning, 3 more children in the settlement have developed the same forehead flush and the same distant glassy stare, and the mothers are beginning to understand, without having any word for it, that a pattern is moving through the community, and that the pattern has chosen the children. Paleopathologists, studying the mummified remains of Pharaoh Ramses II, who died in approximately 1157 BCE, identified pustular lesions preserved in the mummified skin of the face and neck, whose morphology and distribution are consistent with the fatal case of smallpox, providing one of the earliest direct physical records of the disease in a specific named individual in human history. But the disease is older than the pharaohs by a margin that the pharaohs themselves could not have conceived of. Phylogenomic reconstructions of the variola virus lineage, produced by international teams including researchers at the McMaster University Ancient DNA Center and collaborating institutions using next-generation sequencing platforms and Bayesian molecular clock analysis applied to variola genomes recovered from historical specimens, have placed the emergence of variola as a human pathogen in a window stretching back at least 3,000 to 4,000 years before present in its most conservative estimates, with broader models rooted in rodent-borne virus as ants and quackade speak out. The Indian Sanskrit medical text, known as the Sushruta Samhita, whose earliest layers date to well before the current era, describes a pustular fever whose clinical specificity leaves essentially no doubt that endemic smallpox was already an ancient enemy by the time the words were composed. The Hittite tablets from Anatolia record a devastating plague in the 14th century BCE, brought back by soldiers from campaigns in the Levant, whose clinical description of pustular disfigurement and mass child mortality corresponds so closely to smallpox that historians of ancient disease have treated it as one of the earliest documented smallpox epidemics in the historical record. The virus transmits through respiratory droplets and through direct contact with the pustular material, and it is transmissible for approximately 3 weeks from the onset of the rash. A single infected child in a settlement of 40 people, sleeping in shared spaces, and touched by shared hands and cared for by shared adults, will infect essentially every susceptible individual in that settlement over the course of a single lunar month. The case fatality rate for variola major in populations without acquired immunity ranges from 30 to 60%, and among children under 5 the rate climbs higher still, in some documented historical outbreaks approaching 90%. In a prehistoric band of 42 people, an unmodified smallpox outbreak could plausibly kill 20 of them in 6 weeks, and the 20 who died would be disproportionately the children and the elders, the two demographic pillars on which the community's continuity depended. The survivors would carry the scars for the rest of their lives, the pockmarked skin that in every culture and every century became the visible signature of the disease, so recognizable and so universal that entire linguistic traditions incorporated it into standard descriptions of human appearance. The paradox of prehistoric smallpox is that its cure was already present in the environment in a form that no prehistoric human could have conceived of, but that certain observers across scattered cultures did in fact stumble upon empirically. The practice of variolation, deliberately introducing material from a mild smallpox pustule into the skin of an uninfected person to produce a controlled and typically less fatal infection that conferred lifelong immunity, appears independently in ancient Chinese, Indian, African, and Ottoman medical traditions at various points, but there is no evidence that it existed in any Neolithic community. And so the child on the sleeping mat continues to breathe in a rhythm that has become slower and more effortful, and the pustules continue to multiply, and by sundown on the 7th day she will be gone, and by the end of the lunar cycle 6 more children in this settlement will have followed her, and the mothers will not understand why the pattern chose the children specifically, and they will develop rituals to protect the next generation that will not work, and the virus will move on to the next settlement carried in the lungs of a traitor who does not yet know he is dying. You are standing at the edge of an early agrarian settlement on the alluvial plains of the Indus Valley, and the year is approximately 2000 BCE. And the man walking slowly across the outer periphery of the community, keeping a distance that was not there 5 years ago, but that everyone in the settlement has come to understand as necessary, is the man who used to weave the fishing nets that fed a quarter of the population during the flood season. His fingers, which produced those nets with a dexterity that bordered on the miraculous, have lost their sensation entirely across the past 2 years, and in that loss of sensation they have suffered a cascade of small unnoticed injuries, and those injuries have healed poorly, and the tissue has begun to reabsorb itself, and the fingers of his left hand have shortened by nearly a centimeter through a process of gradual bone resorption that no one in the settlement has any framework for understanding. His face is changing too. The bridge of his nose has begun to flatten and broaden, and the skin of his forehead has developed a thickened leonine quality, and the outer edges of his eyebrows have simply disappeared, the hair follicles destroyed by the same slow bacterial process that is remodeling his hands. He can no longer feel the temperature of water. He can no longer feel the sharpness of a blade. He has burned himself twice this month without knowing until he saw the damage. The bacterium doing this is Mycobacterium leprae, and it has an incubation period so long that the connection between exposure and disease is essentially invisible to any observer without modern epidemiological tools. Between initial infection and the first appearance of clinical symptoms, 5 to 20 years may pass. The child who contracts leprosy from a household member at age 6 may not develop the first hypopigmented anesthetic skin patch until she is in her early 20s, and by the time the disease is visible, she has already spent her most infectious years living in unremarkable proximity to a family that has no reason to suspect that she carries anything at all. The paradigm through which this Indus Valley community understands the man's transformation is a paradigm of cosmic imbalance and inherited moral pollution, and it will express itself across the coming centuries in the codification of some of the most durable and destructive social exclusion practices in human history. The leper colonies, and the ritual isolation, and the designation of the disease itself as a marker of spiritual as well as physical corruption. Paleopathologist Gwen Robbins-Shug and her collaborators, publishing in PLOS I in 2009, documented the earliest confirmed skeletal evidence of leprosy in human remains from the site of Balathal in Rajasthan, India, dating to approximately 2000 BCE, in a middle-aged male skeleton whose bone changes displayed the classic signature of lepromatous leprosy, including the resorption of the anterior nasal spine, the atrophy of the alveolar process of the maxilla, and the characteristic pitic and remodeling of the small of the memes. the finding pushed the confirmed antiquity of the disease in South Asia backward by roughly 1,500 years and provided direct physical evidence that Mycobacterium leprae had been present in agrarian human populations at least 4,000 years ago. Ancient DNA studies conducted by Verena Schoenemann, Johannes Krauss, and colleagues at institutions including the University of Tübingen and the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, using targeted enrichment sequencing and phylogenomic analysis of Mycobacterium leprae genomes recovered from medieval European skeletal remains, have reconstructed the deep evolutionary history of the pathogen and placed its most recent common ancestor with modern strains in a window compatible with the prehistoric emergia, with subsequent global locked tree chariots. The disease progresses through two principal clinical forms: the tuberculoid form, in which the immune response is vigorous and the lesions are localized and the tissue destruction is limited, and the lepromatous form, in which the immune response fails to contain the bacterium and the infection spreads systemically through the skin, the peripheral nerves, the mucous membranes, and the small bones of the hands, feet, and face. The lepromatous form is the form that produced the socially catastrophic disfigurement that came to define the disease in cultural memory. The bacterium preferentially colonizes the cooler tissues of the body, which is why the extremities and the face bear the worst of the damage, and why the eyes, the ears, and the peripheral nerves are the tissues that fail first. The loss of sensation is not a symptom in the way that pain is a symptom. It is the primary mechanism through which the disease destroys the body, because a hand that cannot feel is a hand that cannot protect itself, and every trivial injury that would heal invisibly in a normal hand becomes, in an anesthetic hand, the beginning of a slow architectural failure that ends in the disappearance of the digits themselves. The evolutionary genomics of Mycobacterium leprae reveal a pathogen that has undergone one of the most extreme genome reductions in the microbial world, having lost more than half of its ancestral genes to a process called reductive evolution, which has left it entirely dependent on the metabolic machinery of its host and unable to survive outside a living organism for any meaningful length of time. This genomic minimalism is the reason that Mycobacterium leprae cannot be cultured in ordinary laboratory media and remains, to this day, one of the most difficult human pathogens to study experimentally. It also means that the bacterium's continuous presence in the human population across at least 4,000 years, and possibly much longer, required an unbroken chain of host-to-host transmission through respiratory droplets and prolonged close contact. A chain that in the crowded early agrarian settlements of the Indus Valley and the Nile and the Yellow River basins found precisely the ecological conditions it needed to persist. The social death produced by leprosy in prehistoric and early historic communities routinely preceded and often precipitated the biological death. The man walking the outer periphery of the settlement is still capable of contributing labor, still capable of eating and drinking and sleeping and thinking, still recognizably the person he was before the disease began remodeling him. But the community has already begun the process of removing him from its social fabric, and the removal is not cruel in any deliberate sense. It is protective. It is the only response available to a community that has no other tool with which to defend itself against a pattern it does not understand. And so the man walks the periphery and weaves what nets he can with hands that no longer feel the fibers, and a settlement continues without him, and Mycobacterium leprae continues in the household he left behind, waiting in the bodies of children who will not develop symptoms for another 15 years, patient as only a genome-reduced obligate parasite can be, because it has nowhere else to be, and nothing else to do, and no reason to hurry. You are kneeling beside a stone-lying channel in the earliest urban settlement of Harappa in the Indus Valley, and the year is approximately 2500 BCE. And the water in the channel is moving because the engineers of this civilization, whose sanitary infrastructure was more sophisticated than anything Europe would produce for another 3,000 years, have designed a system that carries wastewater away from dwellings and drinking water toward them along parallel channels that were never meant to cross. But channels crack. And this morning, at a point roughly halfway between the central well and the household of the potter's family, a hairline fissure in the clay lining of the drinking channel has developed just below the point where a latrine channel passes 20 centimeters above it, and the two water flows have begun to communicate in a way they were never intended to. The potter's youngest child drank from the well at first light. He is now 7 hours into a decompensation that the settlement has no name for, and his mother is holding him upright over a wooden basin because he can no longer hold himself upright, and because what is coming out of him has changed from ordinary diarrhea into something that resembles rice water more than it resembles waste, a thin, cloudy, essentially odorless fluid that carries flecks of intestinal lining, and that is coming out of him at a rate his small body cannot sustain for more than a few more hours. The bacterium responsible is Vibrio cholerae, and its mechanism of killing is not the destruction of tissue in any conventional sense. The bacterium does not invade the intestinal wall. It does not eat tissue. It does not disseminate through the bloodstream. What it does is produce a toxin, cholera toxin, that binds to receptors on the surface of intestinal epithelial cells and forces those cells to activate a chloride secretion channel with such intensity and continuity that the cells begin to pump chloride ions into the intestinal lumen at rates that no ordinary regulatory system can shut down. Water follows the chloride by osmosis, and the water is drawn from the entire body's vascular volume, and the intestinal lumen becomes a vast one-way pipe that is draining the child's circulatory system directly onto the wooden basin at his mother's feet. Within 12 hours of the first watery stool, a healthy child can lose 10 to 15% of body weight in fluid volume. Within 24 hours, the circulatory system collapses. The eyes sink into the sockets, the skin loses its elasticity so completely that a pinch of skin on the abdomen stands in place like modeling clay rather than snapping back. The pulse becomes thready and then imperceptible. Death arrives not from any specific organ failure, but from the simple mechanical impossibility of maintaining life without adequate blood volume. Paleogenomic studies of Vibrio cholerae have used comparative genomic analysis of modern global strains to reconstruct the evolutionary emergence of the pandemic O1 and O139 serogroups, and while direct recovery of ancient cholera DNA from prehistoric specimens remains one of the outstanding challenges of paleopathology because the bacterium does not leave skeletal signatures and its DNA does not preserve well in the sediments most amenable to archaeological recovery, the phylogenetic evidence combined with the geographic designations, of course the historic ithmans, robidi quarniwickering klein and qualigists, the Sustradosemita, whose earliest textual layers predate the current era, contains descriptions of a rapidly fatal diarrheal illness whose clinical features correspond so precisely to cholera that endemic presence in South Asian populations for millennia prior is essentially certain. The disease requires a specific set of ecological and social conditions to become epidemic, and those conditions were essentially unavailable to human populations before the transition to settled agriculture. A mobile band of hunter-gatherers, disposing of waste at each new campsite and moving on before that waste could contaminate the drinking water, could not sustain cholera as an endemic pathogen. The bacterium requires the specific catastrophe of a stationary community that has begun to concentrate its waste and its drinking water in the same geographic space without adequate separation. The Harappan civilization, for all the sophistication of its engineering, still lived in that catastrophe, because engineering can defer contamination but cannot eliminate it, and every generation produced its own hairline fissures and its own moments in which the two flows communicated. The paradigm through which this Indus Valley community understood the sudden collapse of a healthy child into a shrunken, hollow-eyed husk within a single day was a paradigm of malevolent water spirits and violated ritual purity, and the responses generated by this paradigm, ritual bathing, the offering of grain to the well, the recitation of protective formulas over the drinking vessels, were medically useless but socially essential because they gave the community something to do in the presence of a horror that would otherwise have been unendurable. The idea that an invisible living thing was traveling from the latrine channel into the drinking channel, through a crack the width of a hair, was not merely unknown to this community. It was cognitively unreachable, because the concept of an organism smaller than can be seen was as far beyond their conceptual grasp as the concept of a virus would be to a medieval physician. The case fatality rate for untreated cholera ranges from 25 to 50% in adults, and higher in children, and higher still in the malnourished and the very young and the very old. In a settlement where the water source has been contaminated at a common point, cholera does not kill in the pattern of most epidemic diseases, which spread from person to person along social contact networks. It kills in the pattern of the water itself, striking every household that drew from the contaminated well within the same brief window, producing a burst of simultaneous cases that in a prehistoric context would have appeared to be a single unified catastrophe visited upon the settlement all at once by some outside force. The potter's child on the wooden basin is one of 11 cases that will develop in Harappa this week. By the end of the lunar month, 43 people in the settlement will have died from a single fissure in a single channel that no one will locate or repair, because no one knows to look. And the well will be blamed and abandoned, and a new well will be dug, and eventually a new channel will fissure, and the pattern will resume, because the mechanism was never understood, and the fissures were always going to come. You are inside a semi-subterranean pit, dwelling on the cold steppe of what will become southern Ukraine, and the year is approximately 3500 BCE. And the cold outside is the kind of cold that reorganizes a community's relationship with space, that compresses 14 people into a dwelling designed for 8, that piles bodies together under shared furs during the long nights because separation means death and proximity means survival. The louse living in the seam of the woolen tunic that has not been washed in 6 weeks is the descendant of a lineage of lice that has lived on human bodies for 200,000 years at some point in the past month. And this morning, 3 days after feeding on the woman who was the first to develop the fever, it defecated onto the back of the neck of her husband while feeding on him. And the man scratched the itch without thinking, and in scratching he pushed the louses into the microabrasions his created, and the pactial man consgetted his tick-think-tim. The disease that follows is epidemic typhus, and it has been the constant companion of every human catastrophe that has ever compressed people together in cold conditions without the ability to wash. It has killed in the retreats of every army that ever retreated across a European winter. It has killed in the prisons of every regime that ever built prisons. It has killed in the refugee camps of every displacement that ever displaced people. And it has killed, quietly and continuously, in the winter dwellings of every prehistoric community that lived cold and close and infested in the millennia before the invention of the change of clothing or the concept of hygiene as a distinct practice. The bacterium multiplies inside the endothelial cells that line the small blood vessels of the body, and as those cells rupture, the vessels themselves begin to leak, and the leakage produces the characteristic petechial rash that spreads from the trunk outward in the second week of illness, a scatter of dark red pinpoint hemorrhages that in a firelit dwelling can look almost like a constellation. The fever climbs to 40 degrees Celsius and stays there. The delirium follows the fever, and the delirium is severe enough that the word typhus itself derives from a Greek root meaning smoke or stupor, referring to the clouded mental state of the patient in the second week of illness. Phylogenomic analysis of Rickettsia prowazekii using whole genome sequencing and comparative analysis with the closely related Rickettsia typhi and Rickettsia has established that the pathogen underwent a genome reduction event during its adaptation to obligate intracellular parasitism, retaining only the genes essential for survival inside a eukaryotic host cell and losing the metabolic machinery that its ancestors used to live independently. The coevolutionary timeline of Rickettsia prowazekii and its human louse vector, Pediculus humanus corporis, tracks with the emergence of the body louse itself as a distinct lineage from the head louse, an event that molecular clock studies place at approximately 170,000 years ago, coinciding with the emergence of clothing as a persistent feature of human material culture. The body louse cannot live on the naked body. It requires the fabric of clothing as a substrate on which to lay its eggs and complete its life cycle. Which means that clothing itself, one of the defining adaptations that allowed anatomically modern humans to expand into colder latitudes and eventually populate every continent, was also the invention that created the ecological niche for Pediculus humanus corporis, which in turn created the ecological niche for Rickettsia prowazekii, which in turn began killing us at some point in the deep prehistoric past and has not stopped. The disease is transmitted not through the bite of the louse itself, but through the louse's fecal matter, deposited on the skin during feeding and subsequently rubbed into the wound by the host's own scratching. This transmission mechanism means that the louse population in a single infested community is a self-amplifying reservoir of infection, and it means that the standard prehistoric responses to an epidemic, isolation of the sick, ritual purification, prayer, offered essentially no protection because the vector remained embedded in the clothing of the entire community and continued its work regardless of any ritual intervention. Fumigation with certain aromatic herbs may have provided partial reduction in louse burden in some cultures, and the practice of periodically shaving the head or the body may have reduced head lice specifically. But the body louse, feeding through and living within the fabric of clothing, was essentially untouchable by any prehistoric intervention short of burning the clothes themselves, which in a cold winter meant choosing between typhus and hypothermia. The case fatality rate for untreated epidemic typhus in adults ranges from 10 to 60%, depending on nutritional status, prior exposure, and demographic factors, and in populations experiencing simultaneous famine and cold stress, the rate climbs toward the higher end of that range. In a dwelling of 14 people compressed together for a winter of 6 months, once the bacterium arrived, it would move through the population with a completeness that essentially guaranteed the infection of everyone susceptible, and the deaths that resulted would cluster in the second and third weeks of the outbreak, producing the appearance of a wave of mortality that swept the dwelling all at once and then subsided into the exhausted convalescence of the survivors. The forensic identification of epidemic typhus in prehistoric skeletal remains is essentially impossible, because the disease does not leave a bony signature. Its record in the deep past must be reconstructed through the coevolutionary genomics of the louse and the bacterium, through the archaeological evidence of louse accumbens that appear in the material record of every settled and semi-settled prehistoric culture in the temperate and northern latitudes, and through the direct identification of rickettsia DNA in the desiccated remains of lice recovered from archaeological contexts. Work that has been performed by paleoparasitologists at institutions including the Institute Hospitale and Respironiums. Ready? Let's look right back. The compressed dwelling and the shared furs and the seam of the unwashed tunic are the ecological signature of a disease that has no name in this settlement, and no cure in any settlement anywhere on Earth for another 6,000 years. And the man scratching the back of his neck this morning has already crossed the threshold. And in 11 days the constellation will appear across his chest, and in 21 days deculturate across his chest, and in 21 days he will be delirious, and in 28 days he will iria survive with a permanent alteration of the trajectory of future life. You are standing at the edge of a pastoralist encampment on the grasslands of what will become Kazakhstan, and the year is approximately 4000 BCE, and the cow lying on its side at the perimeter of the encampment has been dead for less than an hour, and the death was so sudden and so complete that no one saw it happen. The animal was grazing at first light. It was standing at mid-morning. It is dead now, and a thin trickle of dark, essentially unclotting blood is issuing from its nostrils and its mouth and its rectum, and the man who has walked out to examine the carcass is the man who will begin dying in 3 days from a bacterium whose spores have entered his body through the small cut on his thumb that he sustained yesterday while butchering a different animal, and that he has not thought about since. Bacillus anthracis produces one of the most environmentally durable structures in the microbial world, an endospore that can survive in soil for decades and in some documented cases for over a century, waiting for the specific combination of moisture, temperature, and organic substrate that will allow it to germinate and resume vegetative growth. The pastoralist community lives in a landscape that is, from the bacterium's perspective, a distributed network of grazing herbivores through which it can cycle, killing the animals, releasing spores into the soil when the animals decompose, remaining in that soil until the next herbivore grazes over the contaminated patch, entering the new animal, killing it, releasing more spores. The cycle is self-sustaining across generations of both the bacterium and the animals, and every so often the cycle intersects with the human, either through direct contact with an infected animal, or through the inhalation of aerosolized spores from contaminated hides, or through the consumption of undercooked meat from an animal that died before it could be observed dying. The 3 forms of human anthrax correspond to the 3 routes of exposure. Cutaneous anthrax, entering through a break in the skin, produces a characteristic black eschar surrounded by a ring of edema and is fatal in 20% of untreated cases. Gastrointestinal anthrax, entering through the consumption of contaminated meat, is fatal in 25 to 60% of cases. Inhalational anthrax, entering through the lungs, is essentially always fatal without modern intervention, producing a rapid progression from initial flu-like symptoms through a brief period of apparent improvement into a fulminant collapse marked by hemorrhagic mediastinitis, massive pleural effusion, and death within hours of the onset of the second phase. The pastoralist man with the cut on his thumb is in the early stages of the cutaneous form, and if he is fortunate, and if his immune system is intact, and if the specific strain that entered him is not maximally virulent, he may survive with a permanent black scar and a lifetime of avoidance of butchering. If he is unfortunate, the local infection will disseminate into the bloodstream, and the bacterium will multiply into staggering densities in the blood, and he will die within a week of a systemic anthrax that produces the same catastrophic circulatory collapse that killed the cow. The evolutionary origin of Bacillus anthracis has been reconstructed through comparative genomic analysis of the pathogen and its close relatives, Bacillus cereus and Bacillus thuringiensis, with the virulence of B. anthracis depending on two plasmids, PX01 and PX02, that encode respectively the tripartite anthrax toxin and the poly-D-glutamic acid capsule that shields the bacterium from phagocytosis. The acquisition of these two plasmids by an ancestral B. cereus lineage represents the evolutionary event that produced the modern pathogen, and molecular clock analysis suggests that this event occurred at least tens of thousands of years ago, well before the domestication of livestock and therefore well before the ecological amplification that made anthrax a routine feature of pastoral life. Once livestock domestication occurred, roughly 10,000 years ago in multiple independent centers, the ecological conditions for sustained anthrax cycling improved dramatically, and the pathogen became a permanent shadow across every landscape in which humans and their herds walked together. Ancient DNA studies of anthrax remain technically challenging because the endospore's environmental persistence means that positive PCR signals in archaeological soil samples may reflect ongoing contemporary contamination rather than authentic ancient presence. But researchers have identified probable anthrax cases in Egyptian medical papyri, in the writings of Homer, where the description of a plague afflicting animals and men in the first book of the Iliad corresponds clinically to anthrax with systemic anthrax with considerable specificity, and in skeletal remains France, the fifth and sixth of the 10 plagues of Egypt as described in the biblical book of Exodus, the plague on the livestock and the plague of boils on man and beast, correspond so precisely to the clinical presentation of a coupled epizootic and epidemic anthrax outbreak that biblical epidemiologists have long treated the passage as a candidate description of an actual documented event. The paradigm through which the pastoralist community understands the sudden death of a healthy animal followed by the illness of the man who touched it is a paradigm of curse and contamination, and the response generated by that paradigm, ritual purification, avoidance of the carcass site, offerings to the spirits of the pasture, provides no meaningful protection against a spore that will persist in the soil for decades and that will emerge again the next time a herd is over that specific patch of ground. Some pastoralist cultures developed empirical practices that provided partial protection: the burial of infected carcasses at depth, the burning of contaminated hides, the exclusion of specific pastures known to have produced deaths in the past, and these practices, transmitted across generations as taboo rather than as biological knowledge, likely reduced anthrax mortality significantly in the communities that maintained them. But the spores remained in the soil regardless, patient as only endospores can be patient, and the taboos eventually eroded, or the memory of which pasture was cursed, eventually faded, and the cycle continued, and the black esser continued to appear on the hands of butchers, and the cows continued to die at first light for reasons no one could quite name. You are inside a temporary hunting camp on the taiga of what will become central Siberia, and the year is approximately 12,000 BCE, and the hunt has ended in a way that will save the band from starvation, because the mammoth was too large to bring down, but the wild boar was not, and the boar is now roasting over the fire in pieces large enough to feed 22 people for 3 days. The meat is cooked on the outside and warm on the inside, and pink at the deepest center of the thickest cuts, because the cooking method is roasting over an open flame rather than boiling in water, and the internal temperature of the deepest muscle tissue has not exceeded 58 degrees Celsius at any point during the cooking, and the incested larvae of Trichinellus duralis living in the boar's muscle tissue have survived the meal, and they are entering their new hosts intact and viable and ready to complete a life cycle that has been running through the wild herbeth. The larvae ingested in the muscle tissue of the boar are liberated from their calcified cysts by the acid of the human stomach, and they migrate to the small intestine, and they mature into adults within 48 hours, and they mate, and the females begin producing new larvae, and those newborn larvae penetrate the intestinal wall and enter the bloodstream and disseminate to every skeletal muscle in the human body, where they encysst themselves inside individual muscle fibers and that can last for decades. The clinical illness produced by this migration and encystment ranges from mild to catastrophic, depending on the number of larvae ingested and the immune response of the host. In heavy infections, the symptoms progress from an initial phase of nausea, diarrhea, and abdominal pain corresponding to the intestinal stage of the parasite, through a second phase dominated by fever, periorbital edema, muscle pain of extraordinary severity, and in the most severe cases myocarditis and encephalitis produced by the larval invasion of the heart and the central nervous system. The mortality rate for untreated heavy trichinellosis in populations without medical intervention can approach 20 to 30% in the most affected cohorts, and in a hunting band that has consumed a heavily infected animal, collectively, the pattern of illness would appear approximately 2 weeks after the meal, would strike every member of the band who participated in the eating with an intensity roughly proportional to how much of the undercooked meat they consumed, and would kill disproportionately the elders whose body provides the systemic effects of the larval abscemic. The muscle pain in the second phase of the disease is severe enough that it prevents ordinary movement, and a band in which 22 people are simultaneously incapacitated by pain and fever in the middle of a Siberian winter is a band that cannot hunt, cannot gather firewood, cannot defend itself against predators, cannot perform any of the tasks required to survive the season. The phylogenomics of Trichinella have been reconstructed through comparative analysis of the 12 currently recognized genotypes of the parasite, and the evolutionary emergence of the genus is dated to a period well before the appearance of Homo sapiens as a species, with the parasites cycling through carnivorous and omnivorous mammals across the northern hemisphere for millions of years before humans arrived to become another host in the cycle. The specific ecological relationship between Trichinella and human hunters emerged with the beginning of large game hunting in the Pleistocene, and intensified during the periods of maximum human dependence on wild carnivorous and omnivorous prey species such as bear, wild boar, walrus, and the various now extinct megafauna of the Ice Age. The archaeological record of butchering practices, cooking techniques, and food preservation strategies in prehistoric northern populations preserves indirect evidence of the presence of trichinellosis, because many of the practices, deep smoking of meat, prolonged boiling, extended freezing, and permafrost caches, correspond to methods that are effective at killing trichinella larvae, and that appear to have been culturally transmitted as necessary components of safe food preparation without any explicit knowledge of why they were necessary. Paleoparasitologist Adato Araujo and colleagues, working with coprolites, mummified tissue, and other biological remains from archaeological sites across the Americas and elsewhere, have identified direct evidence of trichinella infection in prehistoric human populations, in the case reports from Arctic and subarctic populations across the historical record, in which entire hunting parties or family groups fell ill or died after consuming polar bear, walrus, or wild pig, provide a continuous documentary trail of the same India stain, ecological tons extraction The Inuit and other circumpolar peoples developed sophisticated cultural knowledge about which animals and which tissues carried the highest risk, and this knowledge, transmitted as ritual prohibition and hunting taboo, likely saved many lives across the millennia even as it operated without any explicit understanding of the encysted larvae that were the actual mechanism of harm. The paradigm through which the Siberian hunting band understands the wave of illness that strikes 15 days after the boar feast is a paradigm of angered animal spirits and violated hunting protocols. In the responses generated by this paradigm, apology ceremonies directed at the spirit of the boar, ritual burial of the remaining bones, promises of future restraint, are medically useless, but culturally essential because they provide the framework through which the community can make sense of a catastrophe, whose actual mechanism is invisible and whose cure is unavailable. The larvae and the muscles of the hunters will encysst themselves quietly across the following weeks, and the acute illness will subside in the survivors, and those survivors will carry the encysted parasites for the rest of their lives, and the calcified cysts will eventually be visible in the skeletal muscles of their preserved remains if any of them are ever recovered by paleopathologists, and the pattern will continue in the next hunting band, and the next, because the boar was not the last boar, and the mammoth was not the last boar, and the mammoth was not the last quarry that would kill the hunters more thoroughly than they had it. You are standing at the edge of a marshland on the coast of what will become Denmark, and the year is approximately 6500 BCE. And the young man who stepped on the fragment of bone yesterday, driving it through the sole of his moccasin and into the soft tissue between the second and third metatarsals of his left foot, is now on the third day of an illness whose progression is so specific and so consistent and so terrifyingly mechanical that once the process begins, no prehistoric intervention will change its trajectory in any meaningful way. The bone fragment has been removed, the wound has been washed, the wound has begun to look almost healed on the surface. And yet the muscles of the young man's jaw have begun to stiffen this morning, and by afternoon he cannot open his mouth to eat. And by evening the stiffness has spread to the muscles of his neck and his back, and he is beginning to develop the fixed, grimacing expression that will later be given the medical name rhizus sardonicus, the sardonic smile, a rictus produced by the sustained contraction of the facial muscles that no amount of conscious effort by the patient can relax. The bacterium doing this is Clostridium tetani, and it does not need to be present in large numbers, and it does not need to disseminate through the body, and it does not need to invade any tissue beyond the wound itself. The bacterium is a strict anaerobe that grows only in the absence of oxygen, which means it can multiply only in the depths of a puncture wound where the tissue has been closed over the entry point and the local oxygen supply has been cut off, and the small colony of bacteria growing in that anaerobic pocket produces a neurotoxin called tetanospasmin that is one of the most potent poisons known to biological science, active in nanogram quantities, capable of killing a full-grown adult with less material than would be visible to the naked eye. The toxin travels retrograde along the peripheral nerves to the spinal cord, where it binds to inhibitory interneurons and blocks the release of the neurotransmitters glycine and GABA, effectively silencing the neurological circuits that would normally tell the skeletal muscles to relax between contractions. Without inhibitory input, every skeletal muscle in the body begins to contract simultaneously and continuously, and the contractions cannot be voluntarily overridden because the toxin is acting at a level of the nervous system that lies below the reach of conscious control. The young man's illness will progress from the jaw stiffness through generalized muscle rigidity into the arching seizures called opisthotonos, in which the entire back arches so violently that in severe cases the spine can fracture from the force of the contractions themselves. The muscles of the diaphragm and the chest wall lock into a state of sustained contraction that prevents breathing, and death in untreated tetanus is typically produced by respiratory failure or by the aspiration of stomach contents during a generalized seizure. The case fatality rate for untreated generalized tetanus in adults ranges from 40 to 60%, and in neonatal tetanus contracted through contamination of the umbilical stump, the fatality rate approaches 100%, a fact that in prehistoric populations meant that neonatal tetanus was a routine and largely unrecognized cause of infant death within the first 2 weeks of life across every community that gave birth on soil-contaminated surfaces without any conception of sterile technique. The bacterium Clostridium tetani produces environmentally durable spores that persist essentially indefinitely in soil, particularly in soils enriched by animal manure and in the specific geographic contexts of coastal marshland, cultivated agricultural land, and pastoral grazing zones. The prehistoric human landscape provided essentially unlimited exposure opportunity because every step through such terrain and every wound acquired during ordinary activity carried the possibility of introducing tetanus spores into the anaerobic depths of a puncture wound. The disease is not transmissible from person to person, which means it does not produce the epidemic patterns of most infectious diseases and does not appear in the historical record as a wave of clustered mortality. It appears instead as a constant background rate, a steady drip of individual deaths distributed across the population, each one apparently unconnected to the others, but all of them tracing back to the same organism in the same soil, doing the same thing. Ancient medical texts describe tetanus with clinical precision that leaves essentially no doubt about the antiquity of the disease. Hippocrates wrote a case description of tetanus in the 5th century BCE that captures the sardonic grin, the opistotonic arching, and the fatal outcome with a specificity that any modern clinician would recognize immediately. The Egyptian Edwin Smith Papyrus, encoding medical knowledge from at least the 17th century BCE and probably much older, describes head wounds followed by the development of jaw stiffness and death in terms that correspond precisely to tetanus. The Vedas and the Sushruta Samhita include descriptions of the same syndrome. The universality of the description across every documented ancient medical tradition, from Egypt to India to Greece to China, reflects the universality of the disease itself, a consequence of the ubiquity of Clostridium tetani in soil across essentially every inhabited region of the planet. The paradigm through which the young man's community understands his transformation from a healthy young hunter into a rigid arching mask of a person is a paradigm of demonic possession or spirit intrusion, and the responses generated by this paradigm, incantation, the burning of aromatic substances, the application of pressure or restraint to control the seizures, provide no meaningful protection against a neurotoxin that is already bound irreversibly to the inhibitory circuits of the spinal cord. Once tetanospasmin has bound its target, no prehistoric intervention can dislodge it, and the illness must run its course either to death or to the slow gradual recovery that occurs over weeks in the survivors as new inhibitory circuits are synthesized to replace the poisoned ones. The young man's outcome will be determined not by any intervention his community can provide, but by the size of the initial toxin dose and the specific configuration of the receptors it happened to bind, factors as invisible to prehistoric medicine as the atoms that compose them. The bone fragment on the ground where he stepped yesterday is still there. It is still contaminated. The next person who steps on it will inherit the same trajectory, and the community will not know why, and the disease will not have a name, and the sardonic smile will appear again in another face in another season, and the pattern will continue across the millennia in the coastal marshlands, and the tilled fields, and the pastoral grazing zones, and everywhere else that human feet touched contaminated soil, which was everywhere that human feet touched soil at all. You are standing in the shallows of the Nile at flood recession in what will become Upper Egypt, and the year is approximately 5000 BCE. And the water around your ankles is warm and slow-moving and carries a green tint from the algae that has bloomed in the newly deposited silt of the receding flood. And the freshwater snail attached to a submerged reed near your left foot is releasing at this moment into the water column tens of thousands of microscopic larval flatworms called turcarii, and those turcarii are swimming actively through the water toward the warm chemical signature of exposed human skin, and they are penetrating that skin through pores and follicles and microscopic breaks in the epidermis, and they are entering the human body without producing any sensation more noticeable than a brief, mild itch that will fade within an hour, and that no one will remember by even. The parasite is schistosoma, and there are several species that infect humans, the most important being Schistosoma hematobium, which lodges in the venous plexus surrounding the bladder, and Schistosoma mansoni, which lodges in the mesenteric veins draining the intestine. Both species establish chronic infections that can persist for decades, and both species produce clinical disease not through the direct action of the adult worms themselves, but through the immune response to the eggs those adults produce, eggs that lodge in the walls of the bladder or the intestine and provoke granulomatous inflammation, scarring, and in the case of chronic urinary schistosomiasis, a dramatically elevated risk of bladder cancer. The signature clinical feature of urinary schistosomiasis is hematuria, the passage of blood in the urine, and in some ancient Egyptian communities where the infection prevalence approached or exceeded 50%, the appearance of blood in the urine of adolescent boys was considered so routine that it was interpreted as a kind of male menstruation, a rite of passage into adulthood, an event so universal that its actual pathological nature was culturally invisible. Paleopathologists have identified calcified schistosome eggs preserved in the tissues of Egyptian mummies dating to as early as 5000 BCE, providing some of the most direct and unambiguous evidence of a prehistoric parasitic infection anywhere in the paleopathological literature. The eggs are morphologically distinctive. They preserve well in mummified tissue, and their presence in the bladder wall, the intestinal wall, and the liver of mummified specimens is essentially diagnostic of ancient schistosomiasis. Research teams including the Manchester Egyptian Mummy Project under the direction of Rosalie David have systematically screened Egyptian mummified remains for schistosomiasis and have documented infection rates that in some populations approached or exceeded the modern endemic rates observed in the same geographic regions today, indicating that the parasite's ecological relationship with Nile-dwelling humans has been essentially unchanged across the 7,000 years for which we have direct evidence. The disease requires a specific ecological cycle to persist in a human population. The eggs produced by adult worms inside the human host are shed into fresh water through urine or feces. They hatch into larvae called miraculosia that swim through the water and penetrate specific species of freshwater snail. They undergo asexual reproduction inside the snail across several weeks, and they emerge as a cercariae that penetrate human skin during subsequent water contact. The cycle requires standing or slow-moving fresh water, appropriate snail species, human waste contamination of the water source, and repeated human contact with the water. The invention of irrigation agriculture along the Nile and subsequently along the Tigris and Euphrates and the Yellow River and every other major river system where dense human populations developed created precisely the ecological conditions that schistosomiasis required to become endemic and permanent. The engineering achievement that fed the first civilizations was also the engineering achievement that gave those civilizations their first great parasitic burden. The clinical progression of schistosomiasis is slow enough that its connection to water exposure is invisible in any single case. A child exposed at age 5 may develop the first bladder inflammation at age 10, may pass blood in the urine intermittently across the following decades, may develop bladder wall calcification by age 30, and may die of bladder cancer at age 45 without any specific event ever appearing to be the cause of any specific outcome. The disease is a slow tax on the productivity, the fertility, and the lifespan of every person exposed to it, and in populations with high exposure, the aggregate effect on community welfare is substantial, but the mechanism is diffuse enough that no ancient medical tradition ever correctly identified it. Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE and encoding medical knowledge much older, contains what is essentially universally interpreted as a description of urinary schistosomiasis, referred to by the symbol A disease, but the treatments prescribed, ranging from herbal preparations to magical incantations, address the symptom rather than the parasite, because the parasite was invisible and the connection to the river water was culturally naturalized rather than epidemiologically recognized. The paradigm through which the Nile-dwelling community understands the passage of blood in the urine is a paradigm in which the phenomenon is either a normal developmental milestone or the manifestation of a spiritual condition that requires ritual response, and neither of these paradigms generates any protective behavior with respect to water contact, because water contact is not optional in a floodplain agricultural civilization. Every farmer stands in irrigation ditches, every child bathes in the river, every laundress works in the shallows, every fisher wades. The exposure is continuous and universal, and the parasite establishes itself in essentially every susceptible individual across the population, and the infection burden accumulates across the generations in a way that has become so completely woven into the fabric of Nile-dwelling life that it is essentially invisible as pathology and detectable only in retrospect, through the analysis of preserved tissues 7,000 years later. The blood-stained water passing from the boy standing beside you at the water's edge is not a symptom his community can interpret. It is not a warning. It is not a call to intervention. It is a fact, as ordinary as the flood itself, and it will be a fact in his son's life, and in his son's life, and in every generation that stands in the same shallows and draws its life from the same water, because the parasite is patient, and the snails are patient, and the water always returns, and the humans always return to it, and the cycle has no reason to break and every reason to continue. You are standing on the elevated bank above a duck pond at the edge of an early rice farming settlement in the wetlands of what will become the Middle Yangtze Valley, and the year is approximately 6000 BCE. And the domesticated ducks paddling on the surface of the pond are the descendants of wild mallards that were brought into human proximity somewhere between 8 and 10,000 years ago in exactly this kind of environment, and they are shedding, in their fecal matter, into the water, an assortment of influenza A viruses whose natural reservoir is the intestinal tract of aquatic waterfowl and whose global genetic diversity is being generated in real time in ponds and marshes and rice paddies exactly like this one or Crotherth Tut. The pigs that root along the pond margin, drinking the water and eating the plants, and occasionally the ducks themselves, are the co-conspirators in one of the most consequential ecological arrangements in the history of human infectious disease. Pigs possess respiratory epithelium that carries both the alpha-2,3-sialic acid receptors preferred by avian influenza viruses and the alpha-2,6-sialic acid receptors preferred by human influenza viruses, which means that pigs can be simultaneously infected by an avian strain and a human strain, and when that co-infection occurs, the segmented genome of the influenza virus permits reassortment, the exchange of entire genome segments between the two viral lineages, generating novel hybrid viruses whose annotated This is the mechanism by which influenza pandemics are generated, and it is the mechanism that has been generating them since the moment humans domesticated waterfowl and swine and placed them in proximity to one another in the rice farming settlements of Neolithic East Asia and everywhere else that the same agricultural pattern took hold. The reconstruction of prehistoric influenza is one of the most challenging problems in paleovirology because RNA viruses, like influenza, degrade rapidly and do not preserve well in the archaeological record, and because the virus does not leave any skeletal or dental signature that could serve as an indirect marker of ancient infection. The evidence for prehistoric influenza is therefore inferential rather than direct, built from the coevolutionary genomics of the virus and its animal reservoirs, from the phylogenetic dating of the divergence of major influenza A lineages using molecular clock analysis, and from the ecological reconstruction of the specific human environmental configurations required for the virus to establish itself as a persistent human pathogen. This inferential architecture, developed by researchers at institutions including the University of Arizona, the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and the Influenza Reference Laboratories of the World Health Organization, converges on the conclusion that influenza A as a recurring human infection dates to the earliest stages of aquatic bird and swine domestication and has been circulating through human populations for at least the last 6,000 to 8,000 years, and probably substantially longer. The clinical illness produced by a prehistoric novel influenza strain in an immunologically naive population would be qualitatively different from the seasonal influenza of modern experience. The 1910 pandemic strain, which killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people globally in a period of approximately 18 months, provides the best documented modern analog for what a prehistoric pandemic influenza might have looked like, and the features of that pandemic, the disproportionate mortality among young, healthy adults produced by cytokine storm, the rapid progression from initial respiratory symptoms to fatal acute respiratory distress syndrome, in a subset of cases, the near universal infection rate and exposed ameliath hive immunology. The case fatality rate in a novel strain outbreak could plausibly reach 10 to 20% of the total population, and the deaths would be concentrated in the young adults on whom the community depended for labor, defense, and reproduction, producing a demographic shock that would ripple across generations in the form of altered age structure, reduced birth rate, and disrupted knowledge transmission. The pandemic pattern of influenza requires the specific ecological conditions of dense poultry husbandry, adjacent swine husbandry, and human proximity to both, and these conditions emerged first in the rice farming settlements of East Asia during the Neolithic and subsequently spread with agricultural intensification across every region that adopted mixed animal husbandry. The archaeological record of duck and pig domestication combined with the archaeological record of settlement density and animal-human proximity provides the ecological framework within which recurring novel influenza emergence would have been essentially inevitable. Every few decades or centuries, a novel reassortant virus would have emerged from a pond in a rice farming settlement, would have spread from person to person to respiratory droplets, would have moved along trade and migration routes to neighboring settlements and eventually to distant regions, and would have killed disproportionately in populations that had never encountered the specific antigenic configuration before. The paradigm through which the Neolithic rice farming community understands the sudden appearance of a rapidly spreading respiratory illness that kills the young adults preferentially is a paradigm of malevolent air, of spirit intrusion carried on the wind, of contamination of the settlement by unseen forces, and the responses generated by this paradigm: ritual purification, avoidance of specific locations, the burning of incense to drive off bad air, provide no meaningful protection against a virus that is transmitted from person by respiratory droplets and a community that lives grammatic. Some empirical practices: the sequestration of the visibly ill, the burning of contaminated bedding, the temporary relocation of unaffected members of the community may have provided partial reduction in transmission, and these practices, transmitted across generations as ritual response to epidemic disease, likely saved lives even as their biological mechanism remained invisible to those who practiced them. The ducks on the pond continue to paddle, the pigs continue to root along the margin. The virus continues to cycle through the animal reservoir and to spill over periodically into the human population, and the pattern will continue across the millennia. And it is continuing at this moment in ponds and swine pens and live poultry markets around the world, because the ecological arrangement that generates novel influenza has never been dismantled and cannot be dismantled without a fundamental restructuring of the agricultural systems that feed human civilization. The next pandemic strain is being generated right now, in a pond somewhere, in a pig herd somewhere, in the same ecological configuration that generated the first one 6,000 years ago, in the middle Yangtze Valley. And the birds that will carry it, and the pigs that will amplify it, and the humans who will die from it are already in position. And the sequence has not stopped and will not stop, and the community on the elevated bank above the duck pond is the beginning of an unbroken chain of infection that stretches from that specific morning to every subsequent morning in every subsequent millennium, down to the present day. You are inside a Neolithic settlement on the shores of a shallow lake in what will become southern Turkey, in the region that archaeologists will one day call Çatalhöyük, and the year is approximately 7000 BCE. And the settlement is one of the largest human agglomerations on Earth at this moment in history, housing perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 people in a dense honeycomb of mud brick dwellings whose walls are shared between households, and whose roofs form the streets, and whose interiors are entered through openings in the ceiling that also serve as smoke holes for the fires that burn continuously below. And the woman lying on the sleeping platform in one of these interconnected dwellings has been coughing for 6 months, and her coughing has moved through phases whose progression she cannot describe, but whose trajectory the older members of her household have witnessed before in other bodies, and they know exactly where it is heading, and they know exactly where it is heading, and they know exactly how long it will take. And they know that the coughing is not a discrete illness that visits and departs, but a resident condition that arrived at some earlier point in her life, and that is decided this year to complicus kunaijilt. The bacterium is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and the fact of its presence in Çatalhöyük is not a matter of speculation but of direct evidence, because ancient DNA researchers have recovered tuberculosis DNA from skeletal remains excavated at the site, and the paleopathological signature of tuberculosis, particularly the anterior vertebral erosion of Pott's disease, has been documented in multiple individuals across multiple layers of the settlement's occupation, spanning more than 1,000 years of continuous habitation. Tuberculosis was not something that arrived at Çatalhöyük. Tuberculosis was already there when Çatalhöyük began, and it was still there when Çatalhöyük ended, and it moved with the people who moved on, and it stayed with the people who stayed, and it entered the next generation through the same respiratory droplets that had delivered it to the current one. And the chain has never been broken from that morning to this one. The evolutionary depth of the human tuberculosis relationship extends far beyond even the 7,000 years of the Çatalhöyük record. Phylogenomic analysis of the Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex, using whole genome sequencing of globally diverse modern strains, and Bayesian molecular clock analysis calibrated against ancient DNA samples from historical periods, has produced estimates for the most recent common ancestor of the complex that extend backward at least 70,000 years, and possibly further, coinciding with the emergence and dispersal of anatomically modern humans out of Africa. The pathogen has traveled with us across every migration, has adapted to every population, has co-evolved with the human immune system through cycles of selection so ancient and so persistent that the genetic architecture of tuberculosis susceptibility in modern human populations bears the imprint of that coevolution in the form of variants at loci including HLA, SLC11A1, and IL-10, whose distributions correlate with historical tuberculosis exposure. The clinical mechanism by which tuberculosis kills is one of the most patient and architectural processes in the entire microbial world. The bacterium enters the lung through inhalation of respiratory droplets from an infectious individual, and it is engulfed by alveolar macrophages, and instead of being destroyed by those macrophages, it survives inside them by inhibiting the fusion of the phagosome with the lysosome, effectively colonizing the immune cell that was meant to eliminate it and using it as a hiding place. The immune system responds by walling off the infected macrophages in a granuloma, a spherical structure of immune cells that contains the bacterium but does not eliminate it. And in the majority of infected individuals, the granuloma succeeds in maintaining containment for years or decades, or an entire lifetime, producing the latent tuberculosis infection that is the resting state of the disease in perhaps a quarter of the global human population. In a subset of individuals, however, the containment fails, either at the moment of primary infection or years later when nutritional stress or intercurrent illness or old age suppresses the immune system, and the bacterium reactivates and multiplies and destroys the surrounding lung tissue in a process of cavitation that produces the classic clinical picture of pulmonary tuberculosis, the productive cough, the hemoptysis, the fever, the night sweats, the progressive wasting that gave the disease its historical name of consumption. The woman on the sleeping platform is in the final phase of that process. Her lungs contain multiple cavities where the bacterium has destroyed the parenchyma, and each morning she coughs up material that carries billions of viable bacteria into the shared air of the household, and every breath of every family member around her is drawing some of those bacteria into their own lungs, and most of them will contain the infection successfully, and will carry it as a latent penicillin condition for the rest of their lives, but some of them will not, and those who do not will follow her along the same trajectory in the coming years. It is that the transition from mobile foraging to settled agricultural life created the specific ecological conditions under which tuberculosis could transform from a sporadic infection into a densely endemic one. The concentration of people in permanent dwellings with shared indoor air, the proximity of livestock whose own mycobacterial infections could contribute to the human pathogen pool, the increased malnutrition and micronutrient deficiency associated with grain-heavy agricultural diets, and the sheer demographic density that provided the pathogen with an essentially unlimited supply of new susceptible hosts, together generated the conditions under which tuberculosis became the shadow that lived in the corner of every mud brick house in every early agricultural settlement across every acre. Paleopathologist Charlotte Roberts and her collaborators, working across multiple institutions including Durham University, have compiled the comparative skeletal evidence of tuberculosis across the prehistoric record, and have documented the disease at sites spanning the Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas, with a distribution and antiquity that essentially eliminates any possibility of a single point of origin in the historical era. The disease was present in the Americas before European contact, a fact demonstrated conclusively by the recovery of Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA from pre-Columbian skeletal remains at multiple South American sites, and the phylogenomic analysis of these American strains has revealed that they cluster most closely not with human-adapted strains, but with strains found in modern pinnipeds, seals, and sea lions, suggesting a transoceanic introduction from marine mammal reservoirs at some point in the prehistoric Timaeus Day, a finding that has recreated the paradigm through which the Saytolhuyu community understands the woman's slow disappearance is a paradigm of inherited affliction, of the wasting sickness that runs in certain households and that follows certain lineages across the generations, and the response generated by this paradigm is essentially fatalism, because the pattern is so consistent and so unavoidable that no ritual intervention has ever been observed to alter its course. The community accommodates the illness. It does not fight it. It cannot fight it. It can only continue and bury its dead and share its air and produce the next generation and watch the same pattern unfold again and again across the centuries in the same interconnected dwellings under the same shared sky. Mycobacterium tuberculosis has no environmental reservoir. It cannot survive outside a living host for more than a matter of hours under ordinary conditions. This biological fact means that its persistence in the human population across at least 70,000 years has required a continuous, unbroken chain of person-to-person transmission stretching from the very earliest anatomically modern humans in Africa to the woman on the sleeping platform in Seetal-Hoyuk to every human being alive today who carries the latent infection in the walled granulomas of their lungs, a chain so long and so continuous and so intimate from the human lineage itself. Their chain so long and so continuous and so intimate that it is essentially indistinguishable from the human. Everywhere humans have gone, tuberculosis is gone. Every language that humans have ever spoken has contained a word for the wasting cough. Every civilization that humans have ever built has stacked its dead from the disease higher than from any other single infectious cause across the aggregate span of human history. The woman on the sleeping platform will be gone by winter. Her household will continue. Her children will carry the infection. Some of them will die from it in their turn, and some of them will not, and those who do not will pass it to the next generation, and the disease will not stop, and it has not stopped, and it is not stopping now, and there is not a single moment in the entire history of Homo sapiens as a species during which tuberculosis has not been present in the human body, killing at a low, steady rate that across the aggregate of prehistoric and historic time may well exceed the death toll every other infectious disease combined. It is the oldest killer we know. It is the most patient killer we know. It has been with us from the beginning, and the beginning is not a metaphor here, because there is no earlier point in the record of anatomically modern human existence at which it was not already there. And the cough in the shared air of the Neolithic dwelling is the same cough in the shared air of the modern tenement, and the granuloma in the Neolithic lung is the same granuloma in the modern lung. And the bacterium has not needed to change very much because it solved the problem of us a very long time ago and has been waiting quietly inside us ever since, killing whoever falters, sparing whoever holds, and continuing. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.